Hi, so today I'm going to explain how to use the steps for drawing Lewis structures. So the first step, we have to find the total number of valence electrons. To do this, we can use the periodic table. So for example, if we have H2O, we know that hydrogen is group 1 on the table, so it has 1 valence electron. But the subscript says that we have 2. So we are going to take 1 times 2, and then oxygen is in group 6, or 16, so it has 6 valence electrons. So we are going to add that to the multiplication of 1 and 2, and we get a total of 8 valence electrons for H2O. We should also know that a valence electron is the outer shell that forms chemical bonds. So a quick overview. Step 1 is that we take the total number of valence electrons. Well, we find the total number of valence electrons. So if we had H2O, hydrogen is in group 1, so there's 1 valence electron, but since the subscript says there's 2, we multiply it. And then we add the valence electrons of oxygen, which would be 6, because oxygen is in group 6, or 16. And that comes out to a total of 8 valence electrons for H2O. So now, for step 2, we put the least electronegative atom in the center. And we know it's the least electronegative atom because if we look at the periodic table, fluorine is the highest. So okay, so if we look at the periodic table and we see fluorine, and on the left is oxygen and a nitrogen, we know that fluorine is the highest, so anything to the left and away is lower. So if we take NO2, we know that nitrogen is further from fluorine than oxygen, so O will go on the outside. So we'll have O and O. If in the case that we have hydrogen, hydrogen always goes on the outside. That's an important note to know. So we have step 1, find the total number of valence electrons. And then once we do that, we put the least electronegative atom in the center. And we just know whichever goes from the left is further away. Except for hydrogen always goes on the outside. So once we have that, we go to step 3. Step 3 is to put 2 electrons between atoms to form a chemical bond. Okay, so for instance, if we have HCl, hydrogen chloride, we will put 2 electrons between them to form a chemical bond. So here are our 2 electrons. We know it has 8 valence electrons, so we'll put 2 in the center to form that chemical bond. This shows that they are chemically bonded. So now, Step 4. We complete octets on the outside atoms. So sticking with hydrogen chloride, we have 1 for hydrogen and 7 for chlorine. So it was completing octets on the outside atoms for this. We have HCl with the 1 there, and then 6 for chlorine. So the big exception to the octet rule is that hydrogen only needs 2 valence electrons for a full outer shell. As shown here, there we go. Chlorine still needs those 8, and hydrogen only needs the 1 there, or 2 valence electrons. So hydrogen is an exception to the octet rule. It only needs 2 valence electrons for a full outer shell. And finally, step 5. If the central atom doesn't have an octet, we move the electrons from outer atoms to form double or triple bonds. Okay, so if the central atom doesn't have an octet, we move the electrons from outer atoms to form double or triple bonds. So if we have O2, we know that we'll put the valence electrons here. So, but we see that the problem is that this forms an octet over here. However, this only has 6. So we can take 2 valence electrons and move them to the center to share. So for example, we'll take these 2 and move them over here. So now we will have now there's a double bond, and we are still using the amount of valence electrons needed for oxygen too. And that is the final step, step 5. So as a quick recap, to form a Lewis structure, this first step is to find the total number of valence electrons. 1 comes from hydrogen only having 1, but the subscript saying 2, so we do 1 times 2, plus 6, which we get from oxygen being the 6th or 16th group. That comes out to 8 valence electrons for H2O. The second step, we put the least electronegative atoms in the center. So we'll take nitrogen, put it in the center here because it has the least amount, it's further from fluorine. And we'll put oxygen on the sides. The only exception in any situation is that hydrogen would always go on the outside. The third step is to put 2 electrons between atoms to form a chemical bond. So for hydrogen and chlorine, you put the 2 valence electrons in between hydrogen and chlorine and it shows the chemical bond. Step 4, complete octets on the outside atoms. So we have hydrogen and chlorine here. Hydrogen is always the exception to the octet rule because it only needs 2 valence electrons to form the outer shell. But chlorine has the 8 here. And finally, step 5, if the central atom does not have an octet, we move the electrons from the outer atoms to form double or triple bonds. So in this situation, where there's an octet on the right side, but only 6 over here, we would take 2 of the electrons and move it to the center so they can have an equal amount needed. And those are some easy ways to form a Lewis structure.